So a couple years ago, I was moving out of state and I realized that I was going to have to get rid of some of my stuff. There's no way I could take it all with me. One of the items I decided to part with was one of my guitars that I didn't really play much. It was an Ibanez RG series that was easily worth $700 to $800. I didn't have a lot of time and wanted to sell it fast, so I posted it on Craigslist for $550. I didn't use Craigslist a ton, but I've bought and sold a few things over the years and never had any problems. There were a couple people that hit me up right away, but one of the guys, Matthew, seemed really interested. He asked a couple questions, but pretty much said he wanted to buy it right away. He wanted to meet up that night, but I was busy. I told him I could meet with him the following day. He said that was fine, but he couldn't meet until after 9 p.m., which wasn't an issue for me. He asked if I would be able to bring the guitar to his place, but I was always a believer in meeting at a public place versus either of our homes. He said that he wanted to plug it in and make sure it worked before he bought it, which is completely understandable. I told him that I had a small practice amp that I could run off batteries or plug into the inverter in my car to show him that the electronics worked. We planned to meet at the Walmart parking lot at 9:15. I showed up a little early and texted him to let him know where I was parked and what car I was in. I parked in the back of the lot, but very close to the path of the entrance so that there were always cars coming and going close by. He showed up a little after 9:15 and we both got out and I opened my trunk where I had the gear. He was in a small white SUV and I noticed that there was someone else in the car with him, but they never got out. Matthew and I talked for a few minutes as he checked out the guitar and I showed him that it worked. He seemed down to earth and looked to be in his mid-20s. He said that he'd been playing for a few years and was looking to upgrade, but after talking to him for a few minutes, I got the impression that he wasn't a musician at all. He asked a couple of odd questions, which I don't remember now, and he didn't want to play it. He let me show him that everything worked. This only stuck out to me because if you're a beginner, you don't really know what you're doing or looking for, but if you've played for a few years, you more than likely would want to test drive it. Oh well, whatever, I thought. After looking it over, he offered me $500, which was a little less than I wanted to take, but I really just wanted to get rid of it, so I agreed. After that, he didn't give me the money right away. Kind of seemed like he was hesitating or something. He seemed to be a little nervous now, and I noticed he kept looking around for whatever reason. This went on for a couple minutes until he finally gave me the cash and I gave him the guitar and a hardshell case that I had for it. I thanked him, then got in my car and drove off. I was maybe 1 minute down the road and my phone started ringing. Matthew was calling me. I answered and he said, "Hey, I think you forgot something in the case. Can you come back and get it?" I asked him what it was and he said he wasn't sure, but it looked important. I was confused but agreed to turn around and check it out. Before he hung up, he said that he was further down in the parking lot. I wasn't far away, but in the minute or two it took me to turn around, I'd come to the conclusion that there was no way I left anything in the case, and I was a little suspicious. I pulled back in the parking lot, but I didn't see him. He said he moved down a little ways. Well, Walmart is on one end of a huge plaza, so if he moved, he would only go one way. I still didn't see him, so I kept driving further and further away from the area where it's well lit with a lot of traffic. I finally saw his car, parked in the shadows slightly out of view, near a closed restaurant that's out front. He was parked next to a curb facing towards me. There was an open space on his driver's side, but in the next space there was an older Jeep Cherokee. Something was definitely off about this. I slowly pulled up alongside him, but I kept my car in gear and rolled down the window only halfway. I looked over at the Jeep but couldn't really see anything since the windows were tinted. Matthew said, "Hey, come check it out. You probably need this." I asked him to show me what it was. He said, "I can't. You gotta get out and look." I replied, "What? What is it? Why can't you just show me?" He said, "I can't. It's too big." This didn't make any sense, and I was pretty sure he was trying to pull something on me. That's when I caught a glimpse of something in my side mirror and felt someone reach through my window trying to grab me. There was someone at the passenger side trying to open the door as well, but they were locked. I punched the gas and the grip on my arm released as I took off. I drove through the empty parking lot and pulled around onto the street. I didn't look right away, but shortly after I could see that both vehicles were following me in the distance. I called 911 while I tried to get to a busier street, which wasn't far away. I explained what was going on, and the operator told me that there was an officer at a nearby gas station, and he'd be waiting in the parking lot if I could get there. I couldn't tell if the vehicles were behind me or not, since I was on a busy road, but I reached the gas station about a mile away and found the officer. I pulled up and explained the whole story, and gave him the information I had on Matthew. The phone number that Matthew used was a local number, but I found out a couple days later that it belonged to a girl that lost her phone the same day I listed the guitar, so there was no way to track down Matthew, if that was even his name. I assumed the plan was to steal back the cash he had just given me, along with anything else I had. This was a Craigslist story that happened last year. I have a 1969 Camaro that I bought off my grandparents a few years ago. They didn't drive it much in the last 5 or 10 years, so it needed some love, but overall was in pretty good shape. I did a lot of work to it over the winter, and I had some old performance parts that I took off of it. I had no use for them, so I listed them on Craigslist during the summer. The parts I had should fetch a couple $100, so I figured it was worth the hassle. There wasn't much action for a few days until a guy named Randy called and said he was interested. We arranged to meet the following day at my cousin's place. He was going to be out of town for the weekend, and I was watching the dog. My cousin lives in an area where there are a lot of farm fields, and although he's not a farmer, his house is an old farm setup, so he's got a few different barns. I drove my Camaro over there in the morning and pulled it into the back barn to do some work on it. Randy showed up around noon to check out the parts. He arrived in an old square-body Chevy truck and looked to be in his 40s. He seemed like a decent guy, and we talked cars for a bit. I even showed him my car since I had it there and was working on it. This is pretty common in the classic car community. You run into people all the time, whether it's at a gas station or other random spots, where they ask you questions. Sometimes you end up chatting with people for a few minutes about the car or cars in general. I met a lot of really cool people this way. Anyways, after 15 or 20 minutes, we settled on a fair price. He paid me and left. I finished up and drove my car back home a couple hours later. I went back over to my cousin's later, where I was going to stay overnight, but I drove my beater Buick back over there, not my Camaro. I was hanging out inside the house, getting a little work done on my laptop, and it was around midnight. My cousin's dog is a Weimaraner named Marley. While I was working, I started to notice her ears would perk up every minute or two. She's usually very alert, so this wasn't anything out of the ordinary, but I started to question it when it became frequent in the span of 10 minutes or so. I muted the TV in the background to try to see if I could hear anything, but I didn't. She was laying on the couch next to me, and after another 5 or 10 minutes went by, she got up and quickly jumped off the couch. The hair was standing up on her back, but she wasn't barking or anything. She was slowly pacing around the room until I heard a very quiet, single knock sound. That's when she perked up again and went straight for the back door. She stood there and kept looking back at me like she had to go outside. I knew she had just been out about an hour before, so I paused for a second. I was curious about the noise, although you hear random noises out here all the time. There's a lot of oil wells in the area, and the nearby farmers sometimes work at night. I walked to the front entrance and turned on the outside lights, but I didn't see anything. I turned them off and walked back into the living room, and I heard another sound. I wanted to go outside and take a look, just for some peace of mind. I quickly threw on my shoes and grabbed a flashlight and my pocket knife. I called Marley over to the front door. I had to push her back just to get the door open because she was so antsy. As soon as it opened, she bolted out the door in a straight line towards the back barn. I stepped out and turned on the flashlight, trying to follow, but she was fast. For a second I lost sight of her, but I could hear her footsteps tearing across the stones in the driveway near the barn. I ran after and shined the light in that direction. It took me a few seconds to get back there, but as I shined my light, I noticed that the side door to the barn was open. I felt a chill. I knew for sure that I locked the door after I moved my car out of there earlier. I slowly approached the door with my knife in hand, not knowing what I'd find. I reached in and flipped on the light switch, then kicked the door open all the way. No one was there except Marley, frantically sniffing all over and moving quickly around the space. There wasn't much in the barn to begin with, and nothing really looked disturbed in there. I looked at the door and noticed that there were some marks near the latch and on the frame. It definitely looked like someone had messed with the lock. I stepped back out and walked around the side of the building, shining the light around, but I didn't see anything. I turned it off and let my eyes adjust to the darkness, thinking that maybe I would see something in the distance where the light wouldn't reach. I stood there for a few minutes, listening to the constant squeak of an oil well. I was about to walk away when I saw the faint glow of red lights in the distance. Across the field, there's a path from the road that leads to the well. I could see the taillights of a truck as it reached the road. Then the headlights turned on, and the truck was under heavy acceleration as it took off in the opposite direction. It definitely had the sound of an old truck, but I couldn't tell exactly what kind it was. Then I remembered Randy's old square-body Chevy. It had to be him. I reported it to the police just as a precaution. I know I didn't really have any proof that it was him, or that he was actually there and broke into the barn. I just wonder what his plan was if it was him. I'm guessing he assumed my car would be out there, but I never told him that I didn't live there and was only there for the day. About 10 years ago, I had a wild experience on Craigslist. A friend of mine was getting a new car and was going to sell me her old one for an awesome price. It was a substantial upgrade for me that I couldn't pass up, so I posted my car for sale on Craigslist. It was a 1992 Chevy Lumina. It was nothing special by any means, but it ran great and had really low miles for the year. At the time, it was about 20 years old, and I think I was asking like $1,000 for it. People started contacting me immediately. This guy named Leroy called me within a half hour of posting the ad. He said he was really interested and wanted to see it and take it for a test drive as soon as possible. He seemed really nice and level-headed on the phone. Somehow it came up that we graduated from the same high school, and he was 10 years older than I was. Before agreeing on a time to meet, he said something like, "Hey, I just want to be honest with you. If the car is everything you said it is, I want it, but I only have $700. Would you be willing to accept that? I understand if you can't, and I don't want to waste your time, so I thought I'd ask up front." I knew I could get the full asking price for the car, but I was feeling generous, you could say. I was getting a great deal on my new car, and I had decided to pass along a great deal to someone else, so I agreed to sell it for the $700. We planned to meet at my house a couple hours later. I was outside making sure I had taken everything out of the car when Leroy showed up. He rolled up on an old BMX bike, looking pretty scruffy. His hair was long and stringy, and he probably hadn't shaved in a week or two. We talked for a few minutes while he looked the car over. He agreed that it was just as I described in the ad, and he asked if we could take it for a quick test drive to make sure it ran well. I, of course, said yes and hopped in the passenger seat. He started the car and backed down the driveway. All the windows were down as we slowly drove down the road. It was nothing but residential city blocks for a mile or two, so I told him to head south. At first he drove really cautiously, like he was trying to get a feel for the car. We made it several blocks away, and he started messing with some of the controls, checking the heater and AC fan, the radio, the lights. We had gone through a few stop signs by this point, and I noticed that he was pretty touchy with the pedals. He would apply the brakes late and then jam them to make a harsh stop, and then he hit the gas hard when he took off again, causing you to jerk back and forth in your seat. I thought it would take him a minute or two to get used to the car, but it continued, and I started to wonder if that's just how he drove or what. He started rolling all the windows up, making sure they worked. Then he said that everything seemed good, but he wanted to get it up to speed so he could make sure it didn't shake or anything, which was understandable. I told him to head to the boat launch and turn around. It wasn't too far away, and the speed limit was 55 on that road, so he could go faster. It was about this time when I started to realize that he smelled like alcohol. I guess I hadn't noticed it when the windows were down. At first I questioned in my head if it was him. Then I paid closer attention. He definitely smelled like booze. Then I noticed that he would just barely slur a word once in a while. It was very subtle, and I didn't really know the guy, but once I started to pay close attention, I would catch it. Then the jerky stops and acceleration made more sense. Once he was able to drive faster, I could see that he was bouncing back and forth between the lines on the road. We were just about to the boat launch by the time I processed all this in my head, and I wasn't comfortable with him driving anymore. As he turned into the driveway, I pointed and told him he could pull over and I'd drive back to the house. He slowed down like he was going to come to a stop, but then he quickly maneuvered the car in a 180, and I was pushed against the door by the momentum. He drove back towards the road, and I told him to stop the car, more firmly this time. I felt agitated now as I was concerned for my safety. I didn't want to provoke him, but I wasn't alright with riding shotgun while a drunk guy drove my car either. He seemed to be ignoring my request, so I shouted, "Have you been drinking? Stop the car, man." I heard a single chuckle, and he mumbled, "No." Without even looking, he pulled back onto the two-lane road, and almost immediately I heard the sound of a car horn blaring. When I looked in the mirror, there was a car super close behind us, and a dust cloud that they kicked up as they had to veer onto the gravel shoulder. Leroy obviously completely cut the car off. The driver looked furious, and I could see him flipping us off. I yelled at Leroy to pull over and stop the car, but he didn't listen. When I looked over at him, he was just looking forward with a blank stare. The car behind us was right on our bumper as he waited for an oncoming car to pass, and then he sped up and drove around us. He jerked the car back into our lane and then slammed on the brakes, forcing Leroy to do the same. I braced myself against the dash and continued screaming at him to stop the car. He had a crazy look on his face now. The car ahead slowed way down until we were about to hit him, and then he punched the gas. Leroy held the pedal to the floor, but the old Lumina couldn't keep up as the other car was putting some distance between us. A little ways ahead there was a stoplight, and then the road we were on went from a 55 to a 35 mile per hour zone. The look in Leroy's eyes was scaring the heck out of me. He looked like he was out for blood, and he wasn't saying a word. I could see the car up ahead approaching the intersection. The light turned yellow as it squeezed through and turned right. We were going way too fast to be coming up to a red light. I screamed at him again to slow down and stop the car. We were getting pretty close when he finally slammed on the brakes and tried to make the right-hand turn. We were simply going too fast. When he started to turn, the brakes locked up and we slid straight through the intersection. The car bounced up over the curb, and we came to a stop as we slammed into a telephone pole. Leroy opened the door and took off running down the sidewalk. I think I was in shock for a couple minutes. I didn't move until a good Samaritan stopped to check on me. Luckily, I didn't get injured, and no one else did either. I didn't know it at the time, but I found out after the police arrived that there were two kids on bikes that were coming up to the intersection on the sidewalk from the right side. If we would have been a few seconds later, those kids might have been right in the line of fire, and the story would have a real tragic ending. I gave the police what little information I had on Leroy, and they were able to find him a couple days later. My car was pretty much totaled. The front wheel was folded in when we hit the curb, and there was significant damage to the front end. With it being worth so little to begin with, it went to the scrapyard. I still can't believe how a simple test drive went so wrong. In case you were wondering, Leroy never came back to get his bike.